Thanks again for gathering for this first week in a 3-week series, the Food for Body, Mind, and Spirit. Hope you can come. We are going to offer fellowship time again next week if you're interested at 6 o'clock. There was a little bit of debate about that, but seeing people enjoying themselves so much, decided to continue that tradition going next week. So come at 6 if you like. Tonight, we have Vicky Hildebrandt, who is a church member. I don't know, can't remember how many years, about 5 or 6 or 7, 10? Part of our Christian Service Board, and a small group from Christian Service Board was talking and saying, how do we share some of the great things that are happening with church members, that church members are doing with other church members, and said, let's have a theme around who is my neighbor. And so Vicky's going to kick it off tonight, and we thank you for being here and thanking Vicky for being here. Green sheets when you can.
Yep. All right, how are we doing, Lisa? Is that good? All right, good. All right, well, thank you all for coming out tonight. You know, for more than a century, Sheboygan has really drawn new neighbors from around the world to Lake Michigan shores. And one of those new neighbors was my great-great-great-grandfather, Anton Romer, and his wife, Anna. In August 1856, they sailed into New York City from Germany with their 8 children. Their youngest was 9 months old. And they made their way to the town of Wilson, where his brother Ignatz was already farming. Public records show that by July of 1859, Anton and about 10 other families who had come here from Austria had purchased land in the town of Wilson, and they began farming. Now, Anton had been a carpenter in a real small village called Badenburg, Austria. And I've always wondered when I've read over this family history is why did they make this incredibly challenging journey with 8 children, no less, and at what was probably at that time a really high cost? Could he not support his family and that small village in Austria as a carpenter? And what was going on in Austria at that time? So I did a quick, as most people do, Google search. And it showed that in the late 1800s, it was a time of European-wide revolution and general unrest. There were a number of social problems, of course, that were arising as a result of the Industrial Revolution. And in fact, there was a famine going on at that time because there had been a harvest failures in the mid-1840s. So perhaps by the mid-1850s, that in order to survive, Anton and Anna had no choice but to leave their home and to move. So we see that over the decades, many more people have done just like Anna and Anton and moved here. And they have been called a number of different labels and definitions. An immigrant, they could be an immigrant, that's defined as a person who migrates to another country, usually for permanent residence. They could have been asylum seekers, a person who has left their home country as a political refugee and is seeking asylum in another. Or they could have been a refugee, and that's defined as a person looking for economic opportunity or to escape poverty, persecution, a natural disaster. So you can see when we try to define or label these people who have come to our country that there's a lot of overlap with that. And that's why I kind of lean into the definition that amnesty.org has kind of laid out. They say the terms refugee, asylum seeker, and migrant are used to describe people who are on the move, who have left their countries, and have crossed borders. But their reasons for making that decision to move is what differentiates them. Tonight, the new neighbors that we will talk specifically about are the refugees coming from Afghanistan. Now, technically, they are not being called refugees, rather they're being called guests. And tonight, I'd like to do is perhaps explore what we can do to perhaps make them feel welcome, just as other people did to make my great-great-great-grandfather and grandmother welcome to this country. Let's begin, first of all, by listening to one woman's story on her journey from Afghanistan to Wisconsin. After viewing this short 7-minute video from PBS, I'd like us to kind of discuss among ourselves what our ideas are about who is our neighbor and what we've observed is unique about the Afghan and refugee experience. So as you're watching this video, I'd like you to think about these questions. You know, what is your definition of neighbor? What seems to be unique or distinctive about an Afghan refugee experience? And how can a refugee be your neighbor? So with that, let's just watch this video.
Thousands of Afghan refugees are now in the United States following their evacuation as the Taliban took over Afghanistan. Those refugees are mostly scattered among 8 military bases around the United States, but some 10,000 have been released and resettled into different communities. Nick Schifrin has one of their stories.
On the morning of August 15th, when the Afghan government still led the country, Muqaddesha Yorish was where she always was on Sunday, a workday, in her office as a commissioner of Afghanistan's civil service.
I was in office when my mom called me and she wanted me to be home. And I told her, listen, I have to be in office because I have to wrap up a couple of things, so I might be home around 6. And then she told me that it's over.
For 20 years, Yorish had worked to create a modern, inclusive Afghanistan. She'd been a public servant, a former deputy minister of commerce, an NGO leader, a voice of her generation. But that day it all unraveled. The Taliban seized the presidential palace, the city, and the country. Yorish and her family moved from house to house to avoid Taliban fighters now on patrol.
Did you feel like your life was in danger if certain members of the Taliban found you?
Once they took over, reports started coming in of them trying to identify former government officials. We left our entire house because we didn't have the time to pack it, and wish that I would have just taken a final look at our house and at my room, my books. And I just didn't have the chance, you know. I only had a couple of minutes to pack my entire life in a suitcase.
Like so many, she rushed for the airport. She was one of the lucky ones. She got through the chaos and onto a flight destined to the U.S.
I think that's when it hit me that you know, I was leaving and I was flying out and leaving my soul back in the country. So everybody that I knew who was boarding that plane with us were crying. Every single person. It's the first time I'm talking about this, and it's not easy. It's not easy to try to leave home, everything. And nobody does it unless and until they fear for the safety of themselves and their family.
6,800 miles away in rural Wisconsin lies Sparta, a town of 10,000, where American flags fly on Main Street, and nearby Fort McCoy has stood sentry for more than a century. It became Yurish's temporary home, a Spartan sanctuary, disconnected from the life she had to leave behind. Recently, Fort McCoy invited a pool camera to film Afghan refugees' life on base. There are more than 12,000 refugees here, half children.
I would like 2 books, please.
They take classes,
7 days, breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
eat food now certified halal, and live in barracks usually reserved for service members.
The spaces are certainly shared. You don't get to have your private room, so you have to put up with the fact that you will be sharing your space with other families, and we certainly feel grateful for the generosity and the warmness and the hospitality that we have received here. The bigger question for all of us here is what would the future hold for every one of us, and to try to think of just equipping yourself with the right tools to start a new life over when you already had one.
That old way of life is being attacked. Some Taliban fighters have beaten women for protesting. The Taliban detain Afghans they accuse of being criminals and sometimes parade them in the streets. In the central square of the western city of Herat last month, they hanged a man from a crane.
Every day it brings a new atrocity that the Taliban have committed, making sure that women disappear from the public spaces. And then to look back and know that you were actively part of creating that progress.
And now a second catastrophe, economic meltdown. Banks don't have cash. Families are selling furniture so they can buy food. The Taliban can't pay people's salaries. And the U.S. and its allies are refusing to release billions of dollars in reserves.
I would like to, call on the world to tell them that the people of Afghanistan don't deserve being punished like this, and that if anything in the past 20 years, the people of Afghanistan have shown the resilience that the world might not have known.
Resilience from 2 decades of progress. In 16-year-old Mara Matayi's piano virtuosity. Millions of Afghan girls who embraced education as soon as the Taliban were overthrown in 2001. And independent TV channels watched by millions. This weekend, after our interview, Yurish and her family resettled in Washington, D.C.
We feel very lucky to have Muqaddasa Yurish.
And she received an award from former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton for being a change maker.
Join me in my desperate hope for the country, because to be able to do anything, you first need to believe in something. And I still believe in my country.
Yurish insists that she and other Afghans who had to flee are no victims. And on that final day in Kabul, she realized she needed to either get busy living or get busy dying.
Dying is not always physical. If I would have been back home right now, I just would have been a silent observer. To me, that is gradual death in itself. When the Taliban took over, I think I had 2 choices: to stay and die, or try to leave, keep my voice, be here on this show, and try to continue, to do my work and advocate for an Afghanistan that I think the people of Afghanistan deserve to live in. And I decided, and I chose to stay alive, and I chose my voice. One clarity that I have is that anything that I would do will be in the hope that that will take me back home.
For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Nick Schifrin.
Could you put the questions up? There we go. Great. Thank you. All right. So just for a few minutes, like 2 or 3 minutes, either reflect personally or talk to the person next to you. And what I'd like you to do is to just like, let's talk about, what does neighbor mean to you? What does that, when you think of the word neighbor, what is your definition of a neighbor? What or who is your neighbor? And then, you know, what seems to be different about the Afghan refugee experience? And then finally, how can a refugee be your neighbor? So either talk about that with the person next to you for a few minutes, or reflect on that yourself. And then I'd like to hear from you, you know, what is your definition of a neighbor and its relationship to the refugees? Right. So what are you thinking about? Oh. Well, what I love about our congregation is that we're never at a loss for words at all. When we say discuss, we discuss. I know you have a lot more ideas and everything, and I hope that this will be the start of the discussion that'll continue for a while. But I would like to hear, what were some of the definitions that you heard for a neighbor? How do you define, how did you define neighbor in your groups? Anybody hear some good definitions or some good description of what is a neighbor?
We talked about trust. You assume a neighbor that's trust.
Mm-hmm.
And then we said, oh, but think about those bad neighbors. And that's there's a truth to that too. That just because they're your neighbor, you don't necessarily trust them.
Mm-hmm.
Have good or bad neighbors.
Right, exactly.
Talked a little bit about
Yeah.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Right, because when I think we talked about neighbor might be living close to, proximity wise, but also just fellow human.
Mm-hmm.
And then we just were talking about Mr. Rogers, and I'm pretty sure he wasn't saying, "Won't you come live next door to me?"
Yeah.
Yeah.
But he invited them, and that's a really good, he said, won't you be my neighbor? He opened it up and said, you can be my neighbor.
Well, it's funny, we actually brought up Mr. Rogers on Sesame Street too, but we were talking about how sometimes with the proximity too, or in the in the culture we live in, you don't always really know your neighbors, and you don't always have relationships with the people that you would consider to be your neighbors. But Jim brought up a good point about what we're called to show hospitality to those neighbors, and it doesn't even mean the people in your neighborhood. It can be anyone you come into contact with.
That's an excellent point.
I would extend the words that you had listed up there to include sojourner or the stranger. That has we have responsibilities to welcome the sojourner or the stranger.
The stranger, yes, absolutely. That sojourner is welcome that stranger also. That's a really good point. How social media is criticized because it seems to isolate us more than we've ever been isolated. We don't sit on our porches and always talk to our neighbor or wave to our neighbors. So we have to take the effort to reach out and to invite them to be our neighbor and to be to welcome them. Yes.
One question that I had was, you used the term for Afghan refugees as guests, and is that term used because they're not expected to stay?
Well, that's an interesting question. At Fort McCoy or at any of the military bases, they do refer to them as guests. And a lot of the resettlement agencies also say, these are our guests. It was a very conscious word choice that we aren't going to call them refugees, we're going to call them our guests. So what meaning, why is that important? Words are very powerful. What's the difference between refugee and guest?
I would be worried that they're saying they're not going to stay.
Yes, yes.
Like the immigrants were moving here to make a new home.
Right,
and
right.
when you say guest, I don't think of...
But I also think that when you use the term guest, it implies that you're going to provide hospitality. Yeah. And so it can be more welcoming than a refugee where they're a wanderer. Like, where do they belong? Like, you're here, you're our guest.
Yes, that's a really good point, and I think that's what, when that question, how can a refugee be your neighbor? And that's what they were trying to perhaps encourage, was that you're here in our country, you're not imposing, you're not invading, you're our guests here.
And certainly from the perspective of Fort McCoy, they're not staying there, hopefully, for too long. I mean, eventually they'll get resettled somewhere else. Maybe it's to keep the hope alive that, this isn't forever.
Right.
Here.
Right.
With this having to share your public space with everybody.
Absolutely. Any other observations that you'd like to share? So I think what we've kind of seen is that indeed a refugee can be our neighbor, but you definitely want to reach out and invite them to be a part of that. So you could see that this video was made in October. And, it's kind of hard to believe, but this all began at the end of August. That's just barely 4 months ago. And this has been an incredibly fluid time, particularly when it comes to the numbers. So it seems as if the information about the Afghanistan family resettlement in Wisconsin seems to change daily also. But I'll try to give you a current update on where we're at right now, and then try to explain 3 very specific ways that we can help make them feel more welcome and to invite them to be our neighbor, perhaps. In late December, PBS reported that since the Taliban had regained control of Afghanistan in August, the United States evacuated more than 75,000 Afghans through the Operation Allies Welcome. Now, roughly 23,000 of those 75,000 Afghans still remain in the 6 military bases around the United States. Already, more than 50,000 people have been resettled or have been placed in local communities around our country, which is really pretty amazing when you think about it. It does sound impressive, but keep in mind some of the quirks of the system. Once a refugee leaves that military base, any type of funding that they receive ends within 8 months. So you can see there can be, this is not an easy transition for them. So what's happening in Wisconsin? Now, when I say these numbers, they can, and I found them from a couple different, what I thought were reliable sources, they can vary anywhere by a couple thousand either way. But in Wisconsin right now, they're estimating that there are about 4,400 Afghans still in Fort McCoy. Now, the goal of the Defense Department, and I heard this on a Zoom call today, is that by February, Fort McCoy will be empty. Well, you're going to see as we do this that that's not, the nonprofits who are trying to resettle the Afghani people in our communities, that's not going to happen quite as fast as they think. They estimate that about 1,000 Afghans will be resettled in Wisconsin. That doesn't mean that necessarily they'll come from Fort McCoy, they'll come from all of the 6 military bases from around the country. But that's where they think that there'll be about 1,000 people. Afghans have already been resettled in communities that have established resettlement agencies that can support them. And I have, this is the list of the resettlement agencies in Wisconsin. Now, you think 1,000 people, we can do that. But it's been a slow process. And following the news over the last couple months, we can see like in Wausau has only been able to resettle 85 people, Milwaukee about 100, and Green Bay is at about 100. So if 1,000 is our goal, we're not that close to it. What has happened, as many of you know, is in the last 4 years, a lot of the resettlement agencies and support network that we did have in Wisconsin were dismantled, were essentially dismantled. So the nonprofits which exist on a normal day with little staff and limited funds had even less than what they really needed for this sudden influx of people. And it turns out that many Afghans who have entered the United States are assigned what they call a humanitarian parole. And it's a temporary form of protection that has some benefits, but also some limitations. They receive employment authorization. That means they can go out right away and get a job. And as many of you know, if you're an asylum seeker or some other category, that's not always possible. However, they do not receive any federal food share or housing benefits, but they can apply for Wisconsin benefits. And as I also mentioned, the monetary support that the federal funding, the $7 billion that the federal government had set aside for this, once they leave that military base within 8 months, that stops for them. But that's not all that is going on. It turns out the biggest barrier for resettlement, of course, as we know, one is the pandemic, and we've gone cautiously because of that. But the other biggest barrier has been the housing shortage. The resettlement agencies simply cannot find housing. And so that's been one of the biggest barriers to resettlement. So there still is a lot to be done, and the need is still very great. For those, there still is over 20,000 people who are still on the military bases and are looking for a home to resettle. And for those who have been resettled, who are out in the communities, they desperately still need our emotional and our financial support. So, how can you help? How can we help? There are 3 ways that we can help, and that I'd like to just talk about briefly tonight. You can donate, you can volunteer, and you can advocate. In the next few minutes, I'll kind of go over some of the key things that I found that we can and maybe cannot do it even though we would like. But as Julia mentioned, in the back on the green sheets, I do have a more comprehensive explanation of some of the things I'm going to talk about tonight with a few more details. And also some of the web links that if you want to kind of pursue some more information or to even do some of these things, they'll be available to you. I also put in the back an email sign-up sheet. So if you would like, if you put your name on that, I'd be happy to copy that and email it to you so that you could receive the links live in that way. Okay, all right, good. All right, so first of all, the first and obvious one is I want to give something. I want to donate. There are 2 ways. The first thing we think about are in-kind donations. You know, obviously when refugees come here, they have few personal possessions. They need clothing, they need school supplies, they need hygiene projects, furniture. And really the first couple of months that they came here, people were very generous. And the nonprofits or the resettlement agencies, at Fort McCoy, they were inundated with all these things. To the point that donations of such things as clothing and furniture have now become very situation specific. Things that might be more welcoming at this point might be gift cards. Gift cards to grocery stores, gift cards to clothing stores, things like that. And I would really encourage you to check the handout sheet where the key resettlement agencies in Wisconsin are listed and visit their website to see what is needed. For example, in December, I contacted Lutheran Social Services because we thought that would, as a congregation, that would be a good one for us to reach out to because they're an hour away. And I saw that they had pre-assembled kits and they had their list of home supplies. And I thought, boy, that's perfect for us. We could pull together those pre-assembled kits. Well, they don't want them anymore. They've got more than enough. So they've taken that off of their list. They've also have listed on their website that they really cannot accept any clothing at this time or any furniture. However, as they find housing, they never know when they're going to come across the housing that's appropriate for a family, and they bring a family over, that's when they need the furniture or all the things to outfit it. So I'd really encourage you to check the resettlement agencies' websites to see what their different needs are for any in-kind donations, if that's something that you would like to do. A monetary gift is still needed too. Additional financial support can really help pay for rent, new clothes, all those little small comforts that we kind of take for granted. In addition, many of these organizations that serve refugees are nonprofit organizations that depend upon financial support. As I said, they started this behind the 8 ball, not having enough staff and resources in the first place just to serve their existing clients, and then all of a sudden they have a whole new batch. On the sheet, the handout sheet that I have put on there, I put 3 organizations in particular that have been particularly supportive and helpful to us. One is the Wisconsin Conference of the United Church of Christ. They have established, set up a staff to really help all the UCC churches around the state to address this initiative. The other one is the Wisconsin Council of Churches. And they, I was just on a Zoom call today, they've hired a staff person also to help the Catholic Social Services, the Catholic Charities and the Lutheran Social Services, kind of coordinate their volunteer work and the congregations that are interested. It's just another layer of help there. So, and then the Church World Service. So those 3 organizations, if you're really looking for a place to donate, those are 2 that I would recommend, but of course, there's a lot out there. And even the resettlement agencies themselves are in need of financial support. So those are just some of the ways that you can donate of in-kind materials and also monetary if you'd like. What if you'd like to volunteer? What if you want to really get involved? You know, refugees arrive in Wisconsin from overseas may need help practicing their English, doing their homework, learning American customs, and becoming a part of the local community. So I have focused on 2 volunteer options with agencies that seem to have a system in place to handle the volunteers. They are Lutheran Social Services of Milwaukee, and then the one that I just referred to, the Wisconsin Council of Churches, working in collaboration with Catholic Charities of La Crosse. The Catholic Charities have signed a contract with the federal government to provide the learning recreational centers at Fort McCoy and at the military bases. And so the reason they are working with the Wisconsin Council of Churches is to kind of help funnel the volunteers into McCoy. So let me just give you a brief overview of what the opportunities are. At Lutheran Social Services in Milwaukee, this would be more of if you as an individual would like to do something, they're looking for a minimum commitment of 3 to 6 months, once a week for 2 to 3 hours. You might do things as organizing and managing their stored and in-kind donations. You might provide transportation for the families that they do have there to appointments or shopping. You might do child care for some of the parents or single parents, or you might just do a community outing for them. You would need to complete an application, which will include a background check, and attend any orientation or training sessions for that. If you would like more information, you can reach out to me, and I'll put you in touch with the people that I have made contact with in Milwaukee, just to kind of help you have a name and a couple phone numbers in which to accelerate this. Now, if you would like to go to Fort McCoy, the Wisconsin Council of Churches and Catholic Charities has another opportunity for you. This is more of a long-term commitment in which they are looking for people who can come to Fort McCoy for at least a week, work for at least 5 days. Now, they have housing there that's free and is provided. They warn you, these volunteers require high energy, intercultural competency, and flexibility. And what you will do is, as I mentioned, assist them with what they're calling their morale, wellness, and recreation centers that are provided for the Afghan guests in Fort McCoy. You would assist in the recreation center for all, they have for all ages, for women, and children, and school-age children. They have sewing centers they're setting up. So they have all different kinds of centers that you would be assigned to during the days that you are there. They simply require that you be vaccinated, of course, and then that you would have to, in order to get a base pass into the military base, you'd have to provide your driver's license and your phone number and your email information. And I'm working on some of the contacts for that also. So if you'd like to work on an individual basis in Milwaukee with Lutheran Social Services, that's an option. But then if you'd like to actually work at Fort McCoy, that's an option also. And we're also going to work on something that we as a congregation might be able to do to support some of the families that have been resettled in Milwaukee. So finally, the third one is probably just as important as the first two. And that's, we still need you to be an advocate. Your voice is still needed. The spotlight is kind of dimming on this need. It was 4 months ago, and our attention span is not grown the last time I checked. Refugee resettlement is built on a model of community support, helping to build support for refugees among your neighbors, among your family members and your friends at your place of work can really increase your impact on helping us welcome these newly arriving refugee communities. We must also continue to urge the United States government to strengthen its commitment to welcome refugees into our country and to support local communities as they help refugees integrate and rebuild their lives. So see the handout for really specific ways to reach out to your legislatures and what kind of messaging there is. There's a lot of important legislation that is going on there. They initially very generously provided $7 billion in funding. They'd like to add another $4 billion in funding. That's getting some pushback in Congress. And as you can see from the numbers, there's still a lot to be done yet. So reaching out to your legislators and talking to people in your community and advocating for our Afghan guests is still critically important. So these are some of the ways that we can welcome our guests to our community. You know, your presence here tonight really shows that you're a good neighbor. You care about the people around you and your community as a whole. Hopefully tonight you've learned a few ways to support your new neighbors, our Afghan guests, as they seek to reestablish their home. The resettlement of our new Afghan neighbors has and will continue to be a frustrating journey, both for them and for those of us who want to help them. So 2 skills to nurture will be to be patient and to be persistent, just as our Afghan neighbors have had to be as they rebuild their lives here. So thank you very much. And with that, I'd like to open it up to any questions that you might have. Yes, Jim.
Is there a difference between the way Afghan refugees or guests are treated or refugees from other places in the world, like Central America or Syria? Is there any difference?
Yeah, you know, I don't know. I wouldn't know how to, you know, I think the circumstances in which they came here has framed our perception of them perhaps differently than someone who was seeking asylum by coming across the Rio Grande River. Perhaps, I'm guessing, if anybody else, if he has an observation and wants to join in, but my observation is that I think we as a community, our communities might be a little more open to them because of the circumstances in which they were forced to leave their country, because they had been our allies for 20 years in the war in Afghanistan, you know, that we might be more open to them as refugees than we might be to other ones coming from other countries. Anybody else have any other observations on that? Mary?
In your list, does one pop out that's more urgent, more impactful than others?
I think she asked if of any of these three, whether to advocate or volunteer. I think it's everybody's on their own journey of what you feel you can do and what you want to do. I think they're all equally impactful. I personally think each of us, and I've set that as my own goal too, is to continue to advocate, to write my legislator, to write a letter to the editor in our community, to educate people, to talk about it with my friends and my family, to keep that, and because this is not going to be the only group of people that we're going to have to welcome to our community. As I said, you know, for the last 4 years, it really was turned on its head. And we are still suffering the consequences of it now. So I think, for me personally, I think advocating is something that we can do now and should continue to do for a long time.
I'm curious, just having, you know, working in schools and going to our Sheboygan area schools, Sheboygan has been recognized as a placement, a center for refugee placement. I'm not hearing of or knowing of at our schools that we've had families being relocated to Sheboygan. Just because our organizations aren't in a position to be able to support financially and or
Right. You know, that's a real good question. Like, we went through a discernment process here. I mean, Julia brought together a group of people that we thought, well, we could sponsor a family and bring them here. But then as we went through that journey, we realized you bring one family here, they're all by themselves. They don't have a community. So what they are doing is, you saw those 6 resettlement agencies in Wausau, Green Bay, the La Crosse area. They have designated cities or communities in which they are going to resettle them, so they have their community within those communities. And that's why you aren't hearing so much about families specifically coming to Sheboygan. And once, they don't really release them from Fort McCoy unless they have housing, a job, you know, somebody to support them, a family sponsor. And the government, besides the nonprofit agencies, they are allowing individuals, but they want it to be a group of at least 10 individuals to sponsor a family. But when you do that, you want to make sure that they have the support, because it's not just the nuts and, you know, like housing and making sure they have clothing and that. It's the trauma that they have to deal with, and all the emotional and other things that they need support in, not just immediately, but for years to come, we're sure.
And I know Heidi Boehmer would be able to answer this a little better, but I'm going to just try. 4 years ago, or 5 years ago, we were very active in helping with refugee. We were aware that there was a lot of refugees in Sheboygan that needed extra support, because we had a Catholic Charities office here in Sheboygan, and they were doing their best, but they needed help. And so we organized a refugee support community Sheboygan group with Ebenezer UCC, and worked with Heidi, worked a lot with a lot of the Syrian and Rohingyan, and we had Somali. But now that the Catholic Charities have closed their office in Sheboygan, they will not send good thing, because we don't have the resources, because they've closed that chapter. And it closed while we were about 3 years ago or 4 years ago. So that's exactly, if that hadn't closed, we would be receiving more. Do you want to say anything else, Heidi?
Yeah, I did just hear from the Muslim Women's Coalition. We've also worked a lot with the Muslim Women's Coalition in Milwaukee, and they're one of the organizations on the ground in Milwaukee, helping the families find community, and also helping a lot with their physical needs, and then the things like reading mail and registering for school, meeting with teachers. But they said that they keep telling Lutheran Social Services, hey, we think Sheboygan can handle this. And Lutheran Social Services got the contract for all of the people that were settled here by the State Department, those families for the last, it'd be 6 years now, because their initial contract is to support the family for 4 years. And when Catholic Charities left, that left these families with no support. So Lutheran Social Services in Milwaukee is their official assistant, but they're not here. That, it doesn't happen. A few times we've been able to take people down, if they needed to meet with a lawyer or to work on some of the immigration problems if we weren't able to help, which is plenty of times. But that's still in the discussion, even as of this week, that they've said, oh, there's so many volunteers in Sheboygan. So maybe it'll still happen. Maybe they'll be calling us and saying, could you do this again?
Yep. Thank you. Yeah.
Any other questions for Vicky? I think there are definitely members of our congregation who are feel strongly that feel called to work with refugees, and especially Afghan refugees. There's a real, and so we're just still in a place of discernment. Geraldine Leanna, many of you know her, is very much in conversation with Vicky and wanting to maybe go to Fort McCoy. And so the conversation is very much alive. We're just in a point of discernment because we don't know, what we're capable of doing. What's the best way to use our resources? But we're thinking about it and trying to discern the best. And Vicky is just a real gift to be able to sort through all the information that keeps coming, and trying to hone into how we might be able to implement that.
So Geraldine and I are signing up, and we're trying to go to Fort McCoy in February. So if anybody else wants to come along, we'll get you into the system, and maybe you can join us there. Good. So we're, it has been she and I also, just to kind of, when I said fluid, that was an understatement. She and I had reached out to Green Bay, and they said they needed volunteers. We put in our online application, nothing. Then we applied directly to La Crosse Catholic Social Services, nothing. And I'm not being critical of them at all. They're just overwhelmed and can only do with what's right in front of their face right then. So this was what's so excited about the Wisconsin Council of Churches. Kind of they've staffed up to support that and move that forward. And so as we find out where are some ways that we can really move more efficiently, that's really been kind of my goal is to kind of what's going to work and what's not going to work before we kind of put it out there to the congregation so that you aren't spinning your wheels. I'm happy to spin my wheels. I'm retired.
Let's thank Vicky for her time. So this information, and Lisa for her time. Yes. This information, we will get this into the e-post, so just look for some links that will be available. And also, Vicky's talk is recorded tonight, and so we're going to try to get that be able to be available too. Next Wednesday, Heather Cleveland, who just opened up her new green bicycle company, grand opening today. Heather Cleveland, church member, and Natasha Torrey, church member. She is a municipal court judge for Kohler and a lawyer and all sorts of good things. Both of these women are very involved in the Sheboygan equity, diversity and inclusion. It's probably not. The Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging Group for Sheboygan. So they're going to be helping us next Wednesday. They're going to be sharing some of their experiences helping grow diversity and belonging and all those good things here in Sheboygan. And then the following week, Katie Pruitt, church member, new church member, works with trauma-informed care for the Sheboygan Public Health Department. Or am I quite right? For Sheboygan County Health and Human Services. All right, so I got trauma-informed care, right. So that's another, talking about our neighbors as far as helping our neighbors be healthy and safe. So thank you so much for coming out tonight, and we'll see you next Wednesday, if not before. Thanks. Go in peace.